Hey, Pastor, pain and suffering are inevitable, but trauma can be avoided and it can be healed. Today, we will explore how pastors can provide trauma informed care in times of crises. This is the Neuroscience Informed Pastor Podcast, a continuing education podcast for pastors. I'm your host, Josh Spurlock, and I am joined by the lovely Cassie Spurlock. The Neuroscience Informed Pastor Podcast, Neuroscience Informed Pastor Podcast, is sponsored by My Counselor Online. And so trauma, it's a word that gets used a lot in today's society. We're becoming more trauma informed as a society. But what does it mean exactly? And how does it relate to pain and suffering? Like, is pain and suffering and trauma, are they the same thing? Does pain and suffering automatically become trauma? Is there any way to prevent it from being trauma? Like, how do we make sense of all of this? So it's probably a good place to start, wouldn't you say?
I'm super excited because I feel like pastors are on the front lines all the time of hearing about people's trauma. And I just can't wait to get in and help equip them to feel more equipped to help the people that are coming into their space. And we can start by just getting really clear on what trauma is so we know exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah. So trauma is our nervous system's response to being overwhelmed by an experience in a bad way that kind of pushes us outside of our capacity to be able to make sense of what it is we're experiencing. Like it's dysregulating to us, it's overwhelming to us, and it overwhelms our capacity to organize and make sense of what it is we're experiencing. When that happens, that experience is then stored traumatically in our nervous system. And that's what we refer to as trauma. And so when we experience pain and suffering and we lack the resources that we need to regulate our nervous system and to make sense of our experience, then that experience becomes trauma for us. But there's if in the middle of that, that's super important because we can experience pain and suffering and it doesn't have to be traumatic, right? And so what is it that we need in order to have it not be traumatic? What is it the people that we care for when they're going through a crisis need in order for it to not be traumatic? Answer to that is we gotta be able to regulate their nervous system and be able to help them make sense of what it is they're experiencing.
Yeah. So now we have a sense for what trauma actually is. And we have a thought for, okay, in order to help prevent trauma, we want to help a person regulate their nervous system. So, what exactly does that mean to regulate their nervous system?
Yeah. So what does it mean to regulate the nervous system? Right. So I think one of the best ways to picture this is to think about what happens with children when they get hurt or they get injured. Because it's a great picture of it that illustrates really clearly the dynamics of what it is that we're talking about. And it holds true for adults. Like this doesn't change for us. So when a kid injures themselves, falls off their bike, falls out of a tree, scrapes their knee, gets hurt. What what happens? What do they do?
Well, they run into their parents who they trust to comfort them and help soothe them,
Yeah,
help
yeah,
make them feel like it's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay.
yeah. They come in, ooh, hurt and whatnot, and they come looking for somebody to comfort them. And that comfort is another word for that, or a clinical word for that is regulation. And so they come in
Mm.
dysregulated, not, and they're looking for someone to help them regulate or to comfort them. So when we think about, comforting those with the comfort that we've received. We think about kind of being a comfort to others, that the clinical language that we would use around that would be regulating the nervous system that's taking place. So what we're talking about is the kiddo comes in a dysregulated state, needing comfort, and the parent says, "Come here." And with their tone of voice and the words that they use, talking gently, talking kindly, talking softly, and with, a hand on their shoulder, holding them in your arms or lap, or, showing them compassion and kindness, and that helps soothe or regulate the nervous system, which then helps them be able to go, and you see the shift in their body as that regulation starts to take place. And then you can start like asking some questions, because until they're calmed down a little bit, regulated, they're not able to think. The part of the brain that would language their experience isn't online. And so then you're able to be like, "Hey, what happened, buddy? What took place?" And they'll kind of feed you the information the best that they can, and you as a parent kind of reflect back to them what it is that you're hearing. You're like, "Oh, you fell off your bike, it's scraped. Oh, that hurts, that's sad," and that process of them doing the best they can to share what it is that happened, and you reflecting back to them what it is you're hearing, helps them organize and make sense of what it is that's happened with them. And then we provide whatever care that they need, and it's done, right? It's over. And they're kind of like, "Boop," ready to move on to the next thing to do. And, like nothing ever happened, right? No big deal. And that doesn't um, become traumatic for them, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So as pastors, we can come alongside our people in a similar way. And when they run to us for comfort and to provide some sense of safety, some sense of stability, some sense of clarity of everything's going to be okay, how do we help regulate their nervous system? It's not going to be exactly the same, I would imagine. So contextualize it for what we do in ministry work.
Totally. Well, we show up like a good parent, not a good mother or a good father. And as opposed to yelling and scorning or shaming, or kind of when the people come in their distress and they come in their pain, and we meet them with that same gentleness and kindness in our eyes and in our voice, and look into their face and allow the Heavenly Father's face to be seen through ours as we view them with compassion that Jesus had for the people in their suffering. And by being with them and bearing with them those burdens, holding those hard things with them, it helps regulate their nervous system and helps them be able to calm down. And then inviting them to share their story of what's happened and what is happening with them is a way in which they can begin to work with us to help make sense of what their experience is. And sometimes folks are like really out of it, really dysregulated, like it's super fresh, the experience that they've had. And we really just need to help them know that they're safe, that, it confirm that they're in a context, whether it's our office or if we're in their home or wherever it is that we're with them, that it's okay and that they're going to be okay, and help them realize that they're physically safe at the moment, and invite them to take some deep breaths, to notice their surroundings, and that it's going to be okay.
So we're helping them recognize that in that moment they are safe. Like we're listening to them, we're speaking to them with a gentleness, and we're making like asking them if they're actually safe, making sure that their basic needs are met. And then that's the base of whatever else we might be able to, because we got to get them to that foundational level of stabilization before we can help them move forward in any way.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so uh, we're good at pastoring and just being with people and kind of bearing the burdens with them and being the place for them to be able to share. There's also the really practical components of that, right? Where we're not just telling folks to, be warm and be fed and be well, without actually offering the cup of water or the support that's needed. And so there's real basic follow up around, does the person have a safe place to sleep tonight? Do they have access to food and water? Are their basic needs cared for? Do they have somebody in their life who's safe and can walk with them through the challenge that they're facing? So we got to make sure that those kind of basic needs are covered. And then we also need to kind of talk through basic self-care components, and things like, making sure that they know the importance of feeding their body well. That sometimes in a crisis, people don't feel like eating, but if they don't, their body doesn't have the nutrition that it needs in order to be healthy and then navigate the challenge. So, encouraging them, hey, you got to make sure that you're eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, getting lots of water. You got to make sure that you're sleeping. If you can't sleep, you got to troubleshoot that, get in with a doctor and have somebody kind of help you figure that out. Because when your brain doesn't sleep, bad things happen. It makes everything harder and worse. You got to make sure that you're getting some exercise, like nothing too strenuous, but just like doing some stretching and going for a 30-minute walk a few times a day helps to metabolize and flush out the stress hormones that happen in the body when a person's going through a crisis. And you're encouraging them to do some journaling, right? Do some prayer journaling, spend time reflecting on what they're going through and experiencing and capturing it on paper, because that processes the experience in a different way in the brain and helps them move through it. And it also equips them to be able to lean on their community, which there's a tendency to isolate when people are going through a crisis, and encouraging them not to isolate, but to be intentional about leaning on their small group or in their ministry team leader, or those that they have connections and relationships with, healthy family members, is all critical, basic self-care things that will enable them to be able to make it through the crises in the best shape possible.
I feel like sometimes self-care, like the term self-care, has kind of a frivolous reputation, like, oh, I just need to go get my nails done, or I just need to go do whatever. But what we're actually talking about is reminding them to tune in and respect the basic needs that God wired into their existence so that they have the internal resources to face the challenge that they have
Yes,
in their lives.
exactly. It's really
And
about
and how
acknowledging.
do we get them to do it? Because sometimes they feel like stubborn sheep.
No, there's never any stubborn sheep. Never have that experience. Yeah, it's about acknowledging God's design. Good self-care is about acknowledging that God designed the body to function in a given way and to live in accordance with Jesus's design of the body, which is acknowledging those very real basic needs for food, rest, exercise, sleep, human connection, emotional processing. Like all of these things are part of God's design for us and need attending to. And we're living within the reality that God designed for us when we acknowledge those things and care for them and attend to them. And you can, lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And so you can't make people do these things, but we can do our part of making sure that we emphasize how important they are. then what? Right? There's like the
Yeah.
basic pieces of, okay, so we've been with them, we've helped them regulate, we've kind of checked the boxes of talking through their self-care and all of those things. What do we do next? And the answer to that is really about helping folks recognize the losses that are a part of any crises and process the grief that comes along with that. So as we invite them to share their story and we're reflecting back to them, good reflective listening, and that what it is that we're hearing, that back and forth of them sharing and us reflecting and validating that their responses make sense given the circumstances that they've been through, all that helps them organize and make sense of what they're going through in a way that feels really good and helps them not have a traumatic response to the pain and suffering that they're going through. It gives them a framework for making sense of their experience, and it names the griefs, the laments that are a part of the crises that we're in, so that we can grieve with those who are grieving by naming out loud and holding those things together and feeling the emotions that are part of that through to their completion, so that they move through the nervous system instead of getting stuck in the nervous system. We've all met people who are stuck in a loss that happened years ago, and they're not been able to move forward and move past it because they haven't processed the emotional components to it. And so they're not able to move past it. Can't just stuff those things down and ignore them. That's not the way God designed us. That's why we're given the instructions to grieve with those who are grieving, because it requires us doing it together in community in order to move through those things. But that's, part of the process, and it's part of pastoring. It's part of loving one another.
Just thinking about holding two pieces that are challenging as a pastor, always wanting to keep God's goodness and his sovereignty and his love and his care for the people forefront of my interactions with them. And how do I hold that well at the same time with there are some very real losses and some very real griefs? How do I sit in that with a person in a healthy way, and also help orient them to God's goodness in that? It feels like those two are almost opposed, yet I know they cannot be opposed because that's not how God rolls.
And those are the hard things, right? And sitting with people in hard things, as opposed to being superficial and just kind of glossing over things in a way that causes us to lose credibility with folks. That there is evil, there is pain and suffering in this life. Jesus said, in this life, in this world, there will be trouble. Not a promise that we like to claim, but is nevertheless just acknowledging the truth, the reality of pain and suffering, and the goodness of God in the midst of it. Because God doesn't promise us that we're not going to experience pain and suffering. He promises to be with us in the midst of the pain and suffering and see us through. And so we're very incarnational when we reflect that with people, and we are with them in the midst of the pain and the suffering. And we hold both the reality of the pain and the suffering and the goodness of God together with them and help them do so as well, which helps them be able to, again, organize their experience and take that in and have a framework for moving through it in a way that if we deny either sides of that, we don't really help the person that we're with, they get stuck in the difficulty.
Let me ask you a question that I was thinking of in the beginning when you were talking about a person processing, sharing with their pastor what's going on in their life. And, as a pastor, I have a responsibility to lead people into truth, to train them up, to bring them along, to shepherd them well? What if, as they're sharing something with me, I feel like they're doing something that's sabotaging them to get them into the space where they are experiencing these challenges and griefs? Like, where do I share that with them? When's an appropriate time? How do I navigate that piece of my responsibility as their pastor in light of nourishing them, nurturing them, making sure that I don't add to their trauma? It feels like a hard job.
Yeah, it is a hard job. And I think, it takes discernment and wisdom to be able to know the timing of those things. Like there's a time to hold up the mirror and help folks see where maybe there's the self-sabotaging going on. That's a loving act for us to do. And there's a time just to be with people in the midst of the hardship and pain that they're going through. And the one comes before the other. And if the being with them isn't done well, then the holding up the mirror falls on deaf ears. There's the old saying, people don't care what you know or what you have to say till they know that you care. And so the caring comes first, and perhaps the confrontation later. So good question.
Yeah.
And there are lots of good questions to be had around this topic. And we'll just invite our listeners, those watching, those listening, to submit those questions. We'd love to answer your questions, speak to them from a neuroscience informed perspective, as well as from biblical wisdom. Our background, my background was one of having an undergrad in biblical languages and a master's in counseling, and doing more than 10,000 hours of clinical work as a Christian counselor. And so grappling with the theology as well as the practical care components of pastoring is the kinds of things we love to talk about on this podcast. So would invite those listening, submit your questions, and we'll get to them in a future episode. We want to thank our sponsor, My Counselor Online. The Neuroscience Informed Pastor Podcast is sponsored by My Counselor Online, a leading provider in online faith-based mental health. For more than 17 years, My Counselor Online has partnered with churches and mission organizations to provide high-quality care to their staffs and communities worldwide. Because My Counselor Online hires all of its counselors as employees, trains them in a rigorous 2-year postgraduate residency in neuroscience-informed Christian counseling, and supervises them by watching their work and coaching them to develop their skills, they consistently have a success rate above 90%. Today, My Counselor Online cares for around 1,000 families each month, many of whom are pastors and missionaries. So reach out to My Counselor Online to learn how you can partner, or how they can partner with your church to care for your staff and be an extension of your pastoral care team. My Counselor Online is for you too, Pastor. Emotionally healthy pastors lead emotionally healthy churches. My Counselor Online can help you be the best version of yourself for your family and your church. Mention the Neuroscience Informed Pastor Podcast to receive a discount when you sign up. We've covered a lot of ground. How you feeling, Cassie?
I know. I'm feeling super excited. I just love this. I love getting to come alongside pastors, doing what they love to do and helping them feel more equipped and confident to carry out the mission that God has given them of loving and growing and shepherding the church.
That's what we are about. It's what this podcast is about. I want to thank you for joining us today. For more information on this subject, check out the supplemental materials provided in the article that goes with this episode. And if you've gotten value out of our time together, please like and subscribe, and maybe share with another pastor who you think might enjoy it as well. Thanks again for hanging out with us and for being a part of our community. And we'll see you again here soon.